Years ago, I branded a podcast titled Growing Up in Idaho, a show about life as a kid in Idaho and other stuff of intrinsic worth, mainly old memories of salmon and surrounding areas and the crazy things we all did as kids growing up in such a unique place. And you know, the hook that always accompanied the title of the show was talking about the good old days. That phrase has always made me ponder and maybe chuckle a bit. We use that phrase a lot, usually when we want to pontificate on how good things were back in our day versus how bad things are now. And perhaps some might agree that things were a lot better generations ago, especially if you're from that particular generation. But interestingly, the kids who are in grade school now will be haranguing their kids with stories about how much better the 2010s were. It's just how we operate as human beings. To illustrate, when I was a sophomore in high school in 1980, I wore my hair really long. I happened to like it that way, and to their credit, my folks did not give me much trouble about my long hair, or as Dad would say, looking like a damned hippie. But one day, Dad had had enough, I guess, and he pulled me aside and said, "You know, Jeff, when I was a kid, the guys who had long hair were the ones who were so poor they couldn't afford a barber. I know you have the money to go get your hair cut. Why don't you go see Jack Nelson and get it done?" I said, "Thanks for the tip, Dad. I appreciate your concern. You'll be the first to know when I'm ready to walk into Jack's barber shop." But you know, I stopped going to Jack in my early teens because my brother convinced me to go to a beautician, Debbie Lamont. Some of you may remember her. What a great individual she was, and an excellent barber. And she used a straight razor to trim the hair on the back of my neck. That was worth every penny we paid her. Whatever it was, $5 an hour, or $5 a haircut, or whatever. Anyway, I wanted to make the point that when we talk about the good old days, it's usually a matter of perspective how good those days actually were. I remember well the late 1960s and 1970s. As kids, we were constantly being told our hair was too long. We were reminded how much gas cost. You better not be out dragging Maine. Your car gets horrible gas mileage, burning gas like it's going out of style. And there always seemed to be some political scandal keeping people awake at night. Jimmy Carter was president during part of that time. Like folks would say, Jimmy's probably one of the nicest guys in the United States. But how in the world did he get elected president? I'll tell you how. It was a natural political pendulum swing away from the corruption Dick Nixon brought to town. But I digress. I don't want this to turn into a political rant. Frankly, I'm sick of politicians. And as far as the generation thing goes, I just consider that every generation has their package of problems to deal with. And the older generations will always, and I mean always, think theirs was the best. Because it was. For this blog or this podcast, let's go back to the good old days of 1970 and reminisce about experiences in the salmon school system. I'll start off with Mrs. Thomas's first grade class in the old Pioneer School. And by the way, that school building was old when I started first grade in 1970. The fact it is still standing is a complete miracle. My teacher, Mrs. Thomas, started out the school year by choosing her singers. She explained to us that a special group of kiddos would be chosen based on their talent to sing. Her singers, as she called them, would get to sing beautiful melodies to her and the other lucky people. And those kids would also get special treats. I had no idea what that meant, but I figured it must have something to do with candy. The method she used to form her personal first-grade choir was by going from kid to kid and having each one stand next to his or her desk and sing a few bars of My Country 'Tis of Thee. If she thought you were talented enough to be drafted into her singing group, then you were showered with accolades and praise and welcomed like a hero. When it came my turn to sing, I knew my whole future hinged on that moment. It was either success and fame or a lifetime of anonymity and disgrace. Well, I belted out that familiar tune, and I was proud of my performance. Jeffrey Hicks, that was the most horrible sound I've ever heard. Sit down. No way you're going to be one of my singers, Mrs. Thomas said. It was at that very moment I realized my dreams of being the next Elvis Presley were over. I would never become Elvis's assistant, king of rock and roll. Nobody was going to be listening to my records or songs on the radio. I suddenly realized I had to come up with Plan B. And frankly, there was no Plan B. I had officially joined the ranks of non-singers. Thankfully, my best friend Danny had been relegated to non-singer as well, along with a bunch of other kids in the class, most of whom I barely knew. We non-singers were a motley crew, with little sad faces, huddled in our desks, pushing our pencils, trying to color within the lines, just hoping to figure out a way out of our obscurity and awful state. Well, the gloom of not making Mrs. Thomas's music troupe was soon forgotten, as we all were soon let out for recess. Like I said, Danny was my best friend, and our friendship was now even more strong due to the fact that both of us were relegated to the destitute crowd of non-singers. So we walked around the playground, mixing and mingling with our school friends. Hey, Jeff, so who is your girlfriend? Do you have a girlfriend? Danny said. I pointed over to a girl I didn't know and said, there she is. You like Stacy? Danny asked. Yep, I do. I'd never met Stacy, and until Danny mentioned her name, I had no idea who she was. But she seemed like a good candidate to be my first-grade girlfriend. Should be noted that Danny was my best buddy and didn't tease me for liking girls. I was only 6 years old and in the first grade. I really got around in those days. My girlfriend from Ellen Whiting's kindergarten class was Jana. She was the champion hide-and-seek player. And that, in my 6-year-old mind, was pretty spectacular. Plus, Jana was the smartest kid in our class. She could say her ABCs, read simple sentences, and could count to 100 before the rest of us could even write our names. It took some time, but I and all the others got used to life as non-singers. Personally, I found fame and satisfaction in other things, like show and tell, for example. That event was my favorite activity the entire week. It was the time I could zone into my element and tell some wild stories or bring some cool relic from home for which to dazzle all my little schoolmates. One particular day, about halfway into the year, Mrs. Thomas announced it was time for show and tell and to move our chairs to a circle in the back of the class. Suddenly I got a sick feeling. I had forgotten it was show and tell day. How could I have forgotten my favorite activity? I didn't have anything to show, and I had nothing to talk about. I was devastated. Suddenly, an idea popped into my mind. I could make something up. Now, keep in mind, I come from some of the biggest BSers in the history of modern civilization. In my 6 years of existence, I had been privy to some of the tallest and craziest tales known to man. Stories told and retold every time there was a Hicks reunion or any other reason for the family to get together. Plus, my dad, Mike Hicks, was full of tall tales and never wasted an opportunity to sit us kids down to hear his adventures. Anyway, I figured I could hold my own in a simple first-grade show and tell. At any one time, I had a week's worth of crazy stories rattling around in my mind. So, I dragged my chair over, sat down, and got the plot of the show and tell story mentally mapped out in my mind. This was going to be a whopper. When it was my turn, I spewed a great tale about how Dad flew his Piper Cub airplane into the Idaho wilderness area and crashed. Of course, he remembered to strap on his big Bowie knife before leaving home. He used that weapon as he killed deer and bears to eat, all while living off the land as he hiked out of the mountains to get back home. The subplots I wove into the story were extraordinary. All those kids in my class were riveted in their seats. It was obviously the greatest tale they had ever heard. I ended by saying, "And Dad got home just last night. He walked through the door in time to eat supper and tuck me into bed." Well, Mrs. Thomas was not convinced my story was truthful. "Jeff, are you lying?" she asked. "Me? No, I'm not lying," I said. I was a bit perplexed why she would even question me. It was a great story. Why would she be so concerned whether or not it was true? That night, Mrs. Thomas called the Hicks house. Bertie, my mom, answered the phone. Just so happened I was within hearing range as my mom stood there in the kitchen with the phone up to her ear, with that famous stern look pasted across her face, a look that I had seen many times. "No, ma'am, my husband is not a pilot. No, ma'am, he did not wreck a plane. No, he's been home all week. Yes, I'll talk to Jeff. I don't know where he got that story. Thanks for calling. I'll take care of it." Well, you all probably know firsthand or have heard how discipline for kids went back in the good old days. Mom didn't even have to say any words. I knew the gig was up just by her look. All of us kids, got that look when crap was about to hit the fan. If you really want to know, I took my punishment like a man, even though I was only 6 years old and could barely wash my face and find clothes that matched. The next day in school, Mrs. Thomas seemed to take delight in teaching all the kiddos who showed up to class that day a lesson on not telling bald-faced lies. As I sat there in my desk while Mrs. Thomas gave me a royal tongue lashing, all I could think of was, someday I'm going to publish that story. I'll be famous. There's a lot of lessons we learn in those first few years of school, many of which have nothing to do with reading, writing, or arithmetic. The lesson I learned that day was I should have taken voice lessons and learned to sing so someday I could make the big bucks, playing my guitar and singing in a rock and roll band, and not have to scrimp along as a storyteller.